On this episode of Newt's World, in his new book, Downriver, Memoir of a Warrior Poet, Ryan McDermott takes us from the front lines of the 2003 invasion of Iraq, where he led an infantry platoon in several intense battles, including the Battle for Baghdad, as part of the 3rd Infantry Division, through the collapse of Lehman Brothers during the 2008 financial crisis, and into the private struggles of reintegration and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. His memoir explores the emotional toll of combat, the burden of battlefield leadership, and the collapse of identity that follows war and ambition. He examines what it means to survive the battlefield, only to face another war at home, with family, with memory, and with himself. Here to talk about his new book, I am really pleased to welcome my guest, Ryan McDermott. He is a U.S. Army veteran who served from 2000 to 2006, and he is currently Senior Director of National Security Policy at the Aerospace Industries Association. Ryan, welcome, and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Mr. Speaker, thank you for having me on. I'm really excited to be here.
Well, I'm really curious. Why did you choose to tell your story now?
That's a great question. I wrote the book for catharsis. This has been a project of mine, actually, since I was at West Point. There's a scene, I don't cover it all in the summary, but, as I was applying to West Point when I was in high school, my family broke apart. My mother and stepfather divorced, and our home went into foreclosure during my senior year of high school. And I was forced to move out. My mother, at some point later, ended up in a hospital, and a Catholic family took me in when I was to finish out my high school year. As I waited for admission, I got admitted to West Point, and I began my writing process there. And through war, periodically, I've gone back and sort of written for catharsis. That was for me. I wanted to put this out because I've continued to see friends, veterans who've committed suicide. I'm doing great, but I've seen there's been too many veterans, and also just broader society, you see that, and also an awareness to the general public. This is a book for everyone.
You cover a pretty wide slice of life. What was your experience like at West Point, and would you recommend it to young people who might listen to this podcast?
Oh, West Point was just an amazing experience. And I'll have to admit that my book, in terms of that chapter, I don't go into a lot of the detail. There's a little bit I touch upon. I take a different angle because there's a lot of West Point books. But my son Brandon, who wrote the afterword, is actually a senior getting ready to graduate. And so that explains the timing. I wanted my children to have reached adulthood before putting this story out. And my youngest daughter is 18. But West Point is an amazing experience. It brings people from everywhere. I came from a blue collar background and what was a broken home at the time. And the military training, the discipline, the challenge, the intellectual rigor that was instilled there. There's also a lot of character development that goes on at West Point. There's actually a big part of that chapter is really the spiritual introspection that I go into in a very personal way in that chapter. But it prepared me for leadership, prepared me for combat ultimately. And I think a lot of the values that we have as Americans and sort of West Point is just an amazing institution. Anybody that's got a child that thinks they want to serve, I think any of the service academies are a great option.
You're sort of unusual, I think it's fair to say, in that you are not only becoming a soldier and a leader and learning the things they teach, you're becoming a poet. You have to explain that. What was it that got you to be a poet while you were becoming a soldier?
Well, interestingly, West Point has a course where you have to study literature, you study poem, you have to actually recite sort of like the St. Crispin speech is one that I did, and I love it. It's one of my favorite speeches of inspiring. And at one point we had to actually write a poem. And so one of those is in there. And what I found is that poetry is a great outlet for emotion. And that's how it fits in the book is you've got the emotion of the moment expressed along with prose that is in some ways retrospective and more descriptory.
That's great. You're going through West Point. You're becoming a soldier poet. Tell me, where does Lucy show up?
We were acquainted in high school. What's interesting, the family that brought me into their home, and I basically lived with them. Anytime I came off a break, my mother was for a time in a women's shelter, and she rebuilt her life during that time. But the family that sort of took me in, I had my stuff there and I came back. They lived in the same neighborhood. They knew Lucy. In terms of the story here, we met right before 9/11. I had gone through Ranger School, her sister. I had been introduced through my sister. It's a complicated story, but we met and then we fell in love in the aftermath of 9/11. And the context of that time, if you can recall, Mr. Speaker, it was a lot of uncertainty in the world. Both of us, we were eager to start a family, and that's what kind of brought us together. We have a lot of commonalities. She's a more private person, so I don't go into as much detail on her.
Well, I'm not going to try to get you in trouble, but just talk for a minute about one of the high points of your life was Brandon. Talk just a little bit about Brandon.
I want to make sure I show all three of my children equal love. They're all awesome kids. My son, William, is at the University of Central Florida. My daughter is just graduating high school in a week. We had Brandon right before the 2003 deployment. So he was born in December of 2002. So this is the new family I have, my wife, my son, and we get the orders around Christmas time in 2002. We're going to be going to Kuwait. Brandon, he has got such discipline and character. West Point has really molded him from where he was, spiritual development, character development, leader development, educationally. He's about to commission. He's going to be an armor officer, and very excited for him. I think it's the first armored division that's out at Fort Bliss, but he's very committed to service. He wrote the afterword, and I'll spare that, but I think it's one of the most powerful parts of the book.
I can say as a father, watching your children grow up, watching them develop, gives you a whole new life. It's an amazing thing. So you go to war. Do you want to talk briefly about that experience? You're right in the middle of the fighting in Baghdad.
Yeah. So the book covers a few battles. One battle is we were the first across the border at our lane and not much resistance. Fought to Najaf, and this was record pace. We got to Najaf. There's an escarpment where it's a high ground. We were the first to go across that. And then there was the storms. There was a period of time where the sort of sandstorms slowed us down. The focal point of the book really is on the actions from the main assault into Baghdad. My unit, we were the first through the Karbala Gap. This is a geographic constraint point through, and we were the first mechanized unit to cross the bridge at the Euphrates River. And this battle hasn't really been written. There's some articles about it, but this battle, I think, is a major battle. There's a historical aspect to the book, I think, in covering that piece. So the entire U.S. Army crossed the bridge at this point. I cover that in detail. And then the book covers the assault onto the Saddam International Airport. And I think everyone remembers when the Iraqi, I think his nickname was Baghdad Bob, said we were all dead. We were on the airfield at that time when he was making that claim. And then there's some other stuff in the aftermath in terms of the transition from major combat operations into the post-major combat, sort of the stability operations that I go into before the redeployment home.
What did you take from that experience when you came home?
That's a great question. We were very proud of what we did. From a military perspective, we were very proud having executed every single mission. We felt the support of the country as well. There were groups of people that sent banners and pictures, and it's hard to say. I took an appreciation for our country. I mean, I really did. I mean, when you experience something like that and you see the fabric of society, one of the sort of high-level takeaways I took is how important, how lucky we are in our country to have what we have, and just a great appreciation for my family. I mean, as you're going through, there's letters that we've written. We didn't have technology, so it'd be weeks. I'd send a letter and she would read it, and it's like 2 weeks ago, and so you lose touch. I'm talking in a way that's almost like fragmented, and that's how a little bit of the memory is, because you see a lot of things you really shouldn't see. And that's covered in the book. Give you an example. What was written about is the thunder runs. And we're, sort of post-combat operations. This is a grisly detail. There are dead people, and what do you do with them? There's a little bit of that. I try to be unfiltered about the realities of war. There's a lot I still have with me.
It's truly tragic because so many people like yourself did their jobs brilliantly, and it was something we could be very proud of. And in a way, the peak was the initial period immediately after winning. And from there on, it just got harder and more difficult. But you've come home, and when you come home, you make a really big decision, which is leave the Army and go into investment banking. Why did you pick investment banking?
Well, there's a gap. There's something in there I want to cover, Mr. Speaker, because it's probably one of the most important parts of the book. It all translates into the investment banking. So when we got back, we had 2 weeks, and they said, get ready to go back. And that was a hard thing to sort of swallow. I didn't immediately just get out. They did a stop loss. And I think this is a very important part of the book, as I talk about the stateside support of the Family Readiness Group. And there's a part of the book where I go into receiving the families of fallen soldiers for a ceremony to dedicate a tree. And we started that year thinking, okay, we weren't sure, but how much service and sacrifice, you have a mother, a father, and they're coming. They've already heard from the casualty notification officers, but we had to explain to them, here's what happened. Your son is a hero. He died for his country in a worthy cause. There's a scene there that kind of captures that, and there's an evolution of the people that I served with. These were friends of mine I had trained with. They went and deployed that year. They were gone for a full year, and then they came back, and then, you could see them different. During that year, I was sort of in this almost like a disconnection mode. I was reading the casualty list, and I had always wanted to go back and get my MBA. I looked at finance and investment banking as like, hey, I thrive on challenge, and that's a great challenge that I want to take on. And that's what put me on that path. And I had a great experience at the business school. So that's how I ended up making that sort of transition. Part of it was, this is where some guilt. I put my own money behind this book process. And the big reason why is, I left the Army early, and there's a part of me that feels somewhat guilty. This is the part of the PTSD, of the survivor's guilt or whatever. I wanted to put a story out there that appreciates the service, because there's people that serve multiple tours, years of their life overseas. I can talk specifics about the process, but once we got to business school, we had our son during that year when everyone else was deployed. And then we had our daughter right as we went to business school. So we had a full family in our house. And this is right before the 2007 or 2008 financial crisis.
You're at Lehman Brothers, you're doing well, and boom, there's a real crisis. What was that like? You must have felt on one hand, boy, everything's going perfectly, and then the following morning you go, well, maybe not.
Well, I have to say that the year before, 2007, when I did the internship, there were some signs out there. There was a hedge fund that went under, but I talk about how the iPhone came out that summer, and it was just a boom peak year. And there's a scene where I talk about the boom bust cycle. So at the end of the summer, I signed up. I had money. That money helped me get through my second year of business school, the signing bonus. And when we showed up, I have to admit, when we showed up, it was kind of clear things were rocky. At Lehman, they had moved through multiple waves of layoffs. The stress was very high because if you didn't pass test, you were gone. And so that exacerbated. And when it went under, the Friday before Lehman went under, we actually had sort of like a wine tasting event, and it's celebrating the end of our training. And literally that weekend is when the bankruptcy happened.
So how do you deal with that? Are you now part of a bankrupt company? Are they still paying you, or what's going on?
Well, what happened is Barclays Capital bought the bank and the people. And so they did a sort of a post-merger integration. The folks from their company come over, ours come over, and there was some bankers that a lot of people were looking where to go. People with relationships potentially looked to go to other places. They had to lock down a certain number of senior bankers to complete the deal. But at the junior level, you're sort of expendable, and you're just sort of in the wake of all the tidal wave that was going on back then.
From your perspective, if you've come out of the military and a military campaign, which has its own turmoil, and now you've had business school, which sort of seems stable, and then you got a job in a very famous institution, which suddenly wasn't stable. How do you deal with this up and down? I mean, it's like riding an amazing roller coaster. Are you out looking for work?
Yeah, eventually I did. And there's some parts that are intentionally like vague. I eventually lost the job, but then I had a bridge job. And this is the piece that's a little bit vague, is the deterioration of the marriage and our separation, which is how the book begins, that I'm at this rock bottom moment. One thing I wanted to talk about, though, during this whole bankruptcy process, one of the things that hit me was, and this is how the story from Iraq ties into this, is there was a friend of mine from the basic course who I introduced in the story. His name is Travis Patriquin. And Travis Patriquin, there's a book written about him, just about him, that I sort of gave some background to the author from. He was very important in the Sunni awakening in 2006. He was this captain who was able to bridge relationships with the Sunni sheikhs. And the bottom line is he died in, I think it was 2006. It was essentially the same time, the day I was on Wall Street networking for a job. I didn't realize he had died until 2 years later. And the moment that I realized, it was like mentioned on a television program about him, because sort of a high profile contributions to what became the surge and so forth. We were on a mission. We literally freezing cold weather in the lowlands of Georgia during the basic course. And he kept me warm so I didn't get hypothermia. I mean, that's the kind of bond we soldiers have. And so when I learned that he died, it had an effect on me. And I felt enormously guilty that once I got to business school, I didn't keep track of the casualty list. I stopped paying attention to those who were sacrificing for our country.
When you are dealing with all this, it becomes very personal. And I think for a period there, it sort of shook your core commitment and core sense of optimism. How did you deal with that? How did you come to grips with sort of restructuring yourself?
That's a great question. It took a moment where I broke. There's a great quote from Hemingway that has to do, the world breaks everyone, from A Farewell to Arms, that's in sort of quoted at the end. You're strong at the broke places. Once I hit this point, I sought out counseling. This realization that I needed to talk to someone. Now, I don't say this explicitly, but that's kind of the goal, is make myself vulnerable, show that I went through counseling. That's how the book is broken up. There's 4 different counseling sessions. They're dramatized, but to reflect the real process. And so that was really important, is to be able to talk to somebody, get that mirror respect. And that really helped me get on that path. And I have to say, up until that point in time, I was really focused on my career as sort of the means and end. And what I realized at the end of it, and this is kind of a spoiler, is that's my children, their well-being. The focal point of what really matters is their well-being, and making sure that things are lining up, that my world is built around that foundation of the family.
Now, you had separated at one point, but you sort of come full circle when you are with Lucy and you go back up to West Point to celebrate Braden's class of 2025 ring weekend, and now you're watching him parade. Talk about that. Talk about the emotion.
Well, that emotion, and the reconciliation process with Lucy over the years through COVID and everything, just enormous pride. I got to do a walk, march out when they were just out of their basic course. They do a march back from this camp all the way back to West Point. It's about 12 miles. And I have to say, all these kids, all these young men and women, they're choosing to serve after 20 years of war. They've seen that. That's the history. So Brandon, he is very humble. He would say he's just honored. He's humbled to be amongst that group. It was a very emotional moment, because as a parent, I feel it's like I can never do enough, but he's very gracious in that moment.
Your story is both very personal and part of the history of the country. If you could summarize it, what do you hope people will take from your story?
Well, one thing I hope people take from it is there's a lot of introspection and thinking about how the past, the sort of prologue to where we are today. My life is prologue for my children's life. If you sort of rationalize the past a little bit, it can do a lot of good towards focusing on what matters for the future, inspiring that introspection. There was a gentleman who came out who was a veteran, had gone through some difficult time, a divorce recently. I had shared my book, and he was very, very sort of appreciative because I think it helped him feel connected to something like that. But I think general population, Downriver is a book that, if you want a sort of an appreciation for that whole experience, 20, 30 years from now, it does kind of capture some of those moments like Iraq, Lehman Brothers, even 9/11, like what it was like back then.
It reminded me of Faulkner. I'm paraphrasing, but said one time that the past is never past. It's always with us and is always part of the fabric of our life. And I think that that's, in a sense, what you capture. And I think the idea of being a warrior poet is something we could use a lot more of in the American system. Ryan, I want to thank you for joining me. Your new book, Downriver, Memoir of a Warrior Poet, is available now on Amazon and in bookstores everywhere. And I appreciate so much your sharing your life with the rest of us.
Mr. Speaker, thank you for having me on today.
Thank you to my guest, Ryan McDermott. You can get a link to buy his new book, Downriver, Memoir of a Warrior Poet, on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcast and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.